Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins.
Hello, and welcome to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about obesity care and body positivity, and the intersection of those two concepts, which to some people seem to be mutually exclusive. I'm releasing the show today because Obesity Care Week is this week, March 1st through the 7th, and World Obesity Day is March 4th. Obesity Care Week and the organizations that support it have a vision to create a society that understands, respects, and accepts the complexities of obesity and values science and clinically based care. I'll be sharing some resources in the show notes at soundbitesrd.com. Also, during the episode, we discuss personalized nutrition. So I wanted to let you know about a previous podcast episode I did on the topic of nutrigenomics and how our genes and diet interact to influence the way nutrients cause the body to function. It's episode 116, DNA and Your Weight, and I discuss the science as well as my DNA test results and my weight. I hope you enjoy today's episode with obesity and health policy expert Ted Kyle, and also stay tuned to my friend and colleague Jill Castle's podcast, the Nourished Child podcast, because she's interviewing Ted about the experience of obesity through a teenager's eyes. So look for that in early April. Hello, and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Joy Dobbins, a registered dietitian nutritionist. And on the show, we delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition. And today's episode is about obesity and obesity care. One size does not fit all. We're going to talk about the heterogeneity of obesity, and we'll tell you what that is. We're going to touch on body shape, body positivity, and personalized diets and nutrition. My guest today is Ted Kyle. He's a pharmacist and a health professional who is a tireless advocate for obesity science and people living with obesity. His widely read daily commentary reaches an audience of more than 15,000 thought leaders in health and obesity. Welcome to the show, Ted.
Thanks so much for having me, Melissa.
I have been following you for quite some time and was so excited to meet you in person recently at a sponsored conference. And I got to see you speak. And of course, you were already on my wish list of guests. But when I see somebody speak in person and see how dynamic they are and how interested they are in their area of expertise and how great they are at sharing it with others, it makes it that much more compelling for me to kind of close the deal. And I asked you to be on the show and you said yes. So I am really looking forward to our conversation about obesity. You talk about this subject quite a bit. So your platform is Conscien Health, and that's spelled CONSCIEN Health. And you have a daily newsletter that goes out and you're very active on Twitter. But tell me before we get into this topic, because you talk about a lot of things on Conscien Health. I'm particularly drawn to the critical thinking that you share and the research that you sort of break down and tease out and sort of call out some of the things that are either oversimplified or twisted a little bit. It's really very thought-provoking. But before we get into a little bit more about Conscien Health and the obesity topic, I would love to hear about how you became interested in the health professional field and how you came to doing what you're doing now with Conscien Health.
Sure. Well, I'm trained as a pharmacist, and I've been working on obesity for the better part of 2 decades. But my personal experience goes back even farther. I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and quite naturally, my feelings about it run even deeper. I've watched loved ones and myself experience obesity, along with most of the people around me. I got married in the 80s, which is when our current what they refer to as an epidemic of obesity started, and we had 3 wonderful sons. Those are all big life changes, and those are times when many men start growing heavier, and believe it or not, so did I. When men become parents, they gain weight, oddly enough, just as women are at risk of gaining weight, and I've certainly experienced that.
There's a personal piece to the obesity that I would love to hear more about.
Well, I watched not just myself and my immediate family, but my parents. I saw them growing older and having problems, health problems that result from obesity. And after a while, I started working myself on the subject of obesity in my professional life, thinking about obesity. And I started from a place of thinking that obesity was strictly a matter of personal choices. So I was thinking about things and solutions that depend upon personal choices, motivation, readiness to change. That's a lot of the thinking that goes into obesity typically. But I started figuring out that there's more than that to it when I started back in 2001 listening to literally hundreds of people who were living with obesity, but they never said the O word. They just knew they wanted to lose some weight and never have it come back. They knew how hard it was because so many of them had been dealing with it for a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
I guess most of all, though, I remember how grateful they were just to have someone stop and listen to them and try to understand their experiences. We were doing long days of in-depth interviews and focus groups, and every day we did that, sprinkled through the day was people who could not help crying when they talked about it. For us, it was market research. But for them, it was their life, and it was painful. And that's what gave me a clue that all the talk about obesity wasn't being matched by action to help the people who are really affected. And that's really where my motivation to do the things that I'm doing comes from.
Mm-hmm.
I speak frequently and I write frequently about how important it is to be objective about obesity, to be curious about it, to reach beyond the simple answers, but also to bring more caring to obesity and think not just in terms of simple answers, but providing real evidence-based care for the people who are affected.
Yeah, you talk about caring, but also curiosity.
Yes.
For obesity.
Well, there are so many assumptions that we hang on to when the subject is obesity. Assumptions that obesity is a simple matter of eat less or move more. And when you really study the science of it, folks who are intellectually honest about it know that it's very, very complex, that it is the result of a whole web of factors that are working together, starting with a person's physiology, but the environment that they live in, the food systems that sustain us, they interact in ways that we don't really fully understand. And that's why curiosity is so important, so that we can reach beyond the assumptions that make fools of us and really reach into understanding what's really going on.
Right, the complexities and, as we mentioned in the introduction, the heterogeneity and how and why one size does not fit all, and it never will. And with your personal story, I think essentially you would be considered a quote-unquote success story, but yet your path, your journey is very different from what somebody else might benefit from or need. So can you talk a little bit about, I'm totally up to you, but like how much weight you have lost and kept off and what that's looked like for you?
So right now I'm in a place where I'm just shy of, I'm in the range of, in the BMI range that gets defined as overweight, but I'm maintaining a weight loss of about 10 to 20 pounds. And I've been doing that for the long term. And I just came from an appointment with my primary care physician, who unfortunately understands absolutely nothing about obesity and really isn't interested in talking about it. Very interested in talking about blood pressure, lipids, but if the subject is obesity, it's like, I'm busy. That's not one of the boxes I've got to check.
Yeah, and I think there's so many different reasons for that. I think I saw a tweet that you put out about that yesterday or the day before.
You did. You sure did.
I was like, I wonder if that's about Ted.
Well, I came away from that conversation and I realized I need to change doctors.
Yes. Well, we could do a whole show on that. And not that we're into bashing other health professionals or the physician community. It's one piece in an extremely complicated puzzle. And it's a tough topic to talk about. There are no simple answers. But we are going to talk about some of the, I don't know if solution is the word, but at least get us going in the right direction with, we know what doesn't work with obesity, and where do we need to look further with that curiosity and with that care. We're going to talk about how body positivity plays into it, but that it's still okay to lose weight and want to lose weight, and those things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Also, I want to talk a little bit about body shape, because that's one of the things that you presented about at the conference that I saw you. And also I want to mention that the conference was sponsored, but this episode is not sponsored. But you are on the scientific advisory board of Tivity Health, who are the umbrella company for Nutrisystem. And we might touch on some of the personalized programs that Nutrisystem has as well. And even just the concept of how few people actually get in to see health professionals when they have obesity, when they are obese, when they are trying to embark on a weight loss journey, which oftentimes is the first step toward wellness for some people. We want to kind of look at this whole arena. Like you said, it starts with kind of genetics, but we want to look at the environment as well. So maybe we want to talk about first the whole personalized approach. We know that one size does not fit all. We know that there's not one simple answer. But what are you seeing now in the medical community, in the healthcare community, with regard to maybe any glimmers of hope that we are trying to approach obesity in a more productive fashion?
Well, I see a number of things that are going on that are very positive. First and foremost, there is the whole growing realization of the really harmful influence of bias and stigma related to obesity. And this goes back to assumptions about obesity, that obesity is a matter of personal choice, and neglecting the really overarching role that physiology has and how physiology of an individual person interacts with the environment that we live in. Obesity is a highly heritable condition. About 70% of an individual's risk of obesity comes from the genes that they inherit. And then the genes interact with the environment that they live in. So a lot of people get stuck in this thing of, is it nature or nurture? Well, the answer to that question is yes, it's both. But for a person that inherits genes that are resistant to obesity, an obesogenic environment is not going to have that much effect on them. But for somebody who is highly susceptible to obesity, an obesogenic environment is going to have a huge effect on them. So that's the starting point. And the starting point in terms of progress is the recognition that bias and stigma are a huge barrier to progress.
Yes. In one of your sessions, I believe you talked about how implicit bias versus explicit bias. Can you address that a little bit? One is going up and one is going down.
I sure can. So most of your listeners have probably noticed that, I'd say over about the last 5 years, it's become kind of socially unacceptable to shame people based upon their weight or their body size. This label, fat shaming, popped up in popular culture, and it's just not cool. James Corden last fall really came out with a very compelling account of his own struggles with his weight and used that as a way to push back on Bill Maher, who delivered a very shaming monologue about people who had obesity. And that was met with a whole lot of cheers, really. So it's not cool to explicitly shame people, to be explicitly biased, or I'll just say it, bigoted about a person's size or weight. But what happens is that explicit bias has gone down. The implicit bias, the judgments that we make without even thinking about it, have gone up over the last 10 years. And that's different from lots of other kinds of bias where implicit bias has either gone down or stayed constant And that comes from research out of Harvard. It's a big project on bias that they've been doing for years, actually more than a decade. They call it Project Implicit. It is a method that they have that's highly validated. It's been published in multiple journals looking at the automatic assumptions that people make about an individual based upon their race or their skin color or their gender or their sexual orientation or disability or age, and then weight is on that list. And weight is the only form of bias that has actually gone up in its implicit form over the last decade. Explicit bias has gone down. Implicit bias has gone up.
Interesting. I did a podcast episode on weight stigma earlier, actually last year, that was very popular. And I think we're becoming more aware of it, and also aware that not only does it not help, it actually harms, and it makes people sicker. It makes the situation worse.
It does. It does indeed.
And it's not just within the healthcare community. It could be a family member, a neighbor, your community, society in general. But when it comes to healthcare professionals, we absolutely should know better and act better.
Yeah. But, what that reflects is a growing realization that obesity is something that has its roots in our physiology. And that's why the AMA, now it's been about 7 years ago, decided that, yes, indeed, obesity is a complex chronic disease that requires medical attention. That's not to say that they stood up and said, we have the cure for this condition, but it's a chronic condition that has important medical consequences and a physiologic basis. And we need to treat it the same as we would any other chronic condition that's important for health. With that realization, and the realization that we don't have cures, we open the door to the thought that care needs to be personalized. Because what works for one person might work marvelously well for me, or at least it works well. It's been working well enough for me for the last 10 years or so. It doesn't necessarily work well for the next person. We don't have a magic cookbook to say, this is the diet that you ought to follow. And people have kind of proven this in study after study after study.
Right. And you kind of hinted there, but I want to pull that out as well, that what has been working for you, I hope it continues to work. But different things can work for different people at different times in their lives and different stages in their lives as well.
That's right. Just to give you an example, there's a big study called the Diet Fit study, which compared a low-carb diet to a low-fat diet, both healthy diets, and it was a very carefully controlled study. And at the end of the study, what they found was, on average, those two diets had very similar efficacy in terms of how much people lost weight on each of them. But for each of them, different people had different experiences. Some people actually gained weight on each of those diets. Some people lost some amazing amounts of weight on each of those diets after 12 months. Different people respond differently. Some people, and as a dietitian, you probably know this, some people will do very well on a low-carb diet. And for some people, it's close to a death sentence if they can't have carbs in their diet. And it's not going to work well for them.
Yeah, I think being a certified diabetes educator really gave me an extra insight into that individual need. And of course, dietitians are trained that we individualize diets. That's our mantra. It's individualized. But even just seeing, okay, the population with diabetes will in general do better on a lower carb diet, which doesn't necessarily mean low, less carbs or reduction in carbs than a population that doesn't have diabetes. And so I think having that experience was a very clear incentive for me to kind of dig my heels in at some of the, this diet is the be all end all answer. It's like, well, everybody's different, so people are going to respond differently. So to your point, like with this Diet Fit study, it's always helpful to see. It's frustrating. We would like to say, okay, boom, here it is. This is what works. Although even if something was the magic pill and it did work and it was the magic diet, I think different people would have different preferences and different tolerance for the types of food that that particular diet would require. I mean, I think it's not only what works, but what is our lifestyle like and what are our preferences. So there's so many different layers there. But yes, to your point, it's great to see the hard data to back up what we know intuitively is true. But then we hear all these conflicting messages, or I should say opposing messages in the media about this all the time.
And to a certain extent, that's just human nature.
Yeah.
At work. You have somebody who's found something that works very well for them.
Yeah, they want to shout it from the rooftops.
That's right. Yeah. And what works for one definitely works for one. Sometimes it works for other people. Sometimes it works for a lot of people, but it very seldom works for everybody.
Right.
Looking at that Diet Fit study, there were people on that study who lost 15 or 20% of their starting body weight on each of those diets. And those are truly remarkable results that start to get up toward the kind of results that you can see with bariatric surgery.
Yeah.
So that's really amazing. So for those people, those diets were really wonderful. But it wasn't the majority of those patients.
Mm-hmm.
It is the fact that those patients who experience that are going to have very strong feelings about that diet and really want to share their experience.
Yes, it's hard work either way, even when it does work.
Well, the ultimate in personalization really comes from people like yourself who are registered dietitians who really understand the science behind nutrition and can help a person in their personal journey find what that best path is for themselves in terms of a healthy diet. That's kind of what I would call the gold standard in personalizing a diet.
Yes, thank you. That is our role as dietitians, and that is what we set out to do. And obviously not everybody sees a dietitian or can see a dietitian. And we try to communicate effectively through media and social media. But I always say this on the show, things get lost in translation when we go from that individualized one-on-one approach to trying to spread information out to the masses. It can lose that individualized lens, and that's where I think as dietitians and healthcare professionals, we run the risk of oversimplifying and being a little bit too generic in our attempts to try to help people and not just say, well, it's all individual, so, we want to give them something. But I do think we are making great strides in communicating that here's what the evidence shows. At the end of the day, we know the only diet that works is the one that you can stick with. And that, of course, we as dietitians encourage people to try to choose a diet that provides proper nutrition, that's not cutting out entire food groups or isn't giving them adequate nutrients, fiber, protein, calcium, things like that, so that it might work for weight control or blood sugar control, but then are they left with nutrient deficiencies, which of course we don't want. But in part of this personalization culture that we're seeing now in the diet arena, one of the things that you talked about in your presentation was something that we've all heard, but there was more to the story, and that is body type, body shape. I think it's probably not news for anybody to think about like the apple shape versus the pear shape, and that we know that the apple shape, body type shape, tends to bring with it more cardiovascular risk. But can you talk a little bit about the science of these body types? In particular, I think the part that was somewhat new to me was, okay, so we know that these different body shapes have different cardiometabolic activity or connections. How does that translate into diet recommendations? So we're familiar with the apple and the pear, but there's also rectangle and hourglass. So can you speak to that a little bit? Because I think that was interesting, and I'd like to share that with the listeners.
Well, what I would say is that paying attention to a person's body type is something that connects with people, because people have this visceral understanding of how my body shape influences how I look at food and how I look at the world. And so when people have lived with a body that wants to conform to that apple shape or that pear shape all of their life, they say, well, that's me. And I understand what that's all about because that's been my lived experience. And without going into a lot of the development detail, what the folks at Nutrisystem did with their body shape approach is to look at how people with different body shapes experienced different kinds of diets and what things are important to them. And I won't profess to be an expert on the psychological research that they did there, but it's an effort to provide a degree of personalization that can help people find what's going to work best for them. And that comes back to what we talked about a minute or two ago about registered dietitians being the gold standard of personalization. The problem with that is that 90% of people living with obesity, and this was a study that was done at Boston University by Andrew Stokes, 90% of people living with obesity never, ever talk to any healthcare professional about obesity.
Right.
Not a dietitian, not a nurse, not a PA, not a physician. In fact, only about 4% of patients, people with obesity, ever talk to a physician about it.
Wow.
And so it is important to equip people with ways that they can start to understand their own physiology and how their body works and what works for their body. And that idea of what works needs to be based in more science than you see in the infomercials and some of the really what I will call dietary supplement magic pills, that get foisted onto consumers without a lot of science behind them. And body personalizing according to body type is just one tool for doing that.
Yes, as I said, the whole apple pear thing, I remember hearing about that, and it makes perfect sense with the cardiovascular risk, but the science that exists now that shows based on body composition, it makes sense. The apple body type has more of the visceral fat and the higher waist to hip ratio, and that type of body shape tends to respond better to a reduced carbohydrate intake. And again, that's not a low carbohydrate necessarily, but they tend to do better with lower carbohydrate, higher quality carbohydrates, whereas the pear, hourglass, and rectangle, they're storing fat in different area, the hips area, and they tend to be associated with higher estrogen levels. And the diets that tend to work better in those body types are low in saturated fat and high in fiber. So I found that very interesting. And like you said, the science continues to evolve. And how can we, so we've got this great concept. We know that individualized and personalized is necessary, but what does that look like when we look at the science? And that continues to evolve. But I think it is very promising to at least start with that approach. And, again, most people aren't even seeing a dietitian, let alone a physician, having that conversation about weight. And again, it's a difficult conversation. My father, in his later years, he had gained a lot of weight and he got diabetes. And it was very interesting to hear what the conversations with his physician were like. And I've talked on the show about my son, who is not overweight. He's always been around the 75th, 80th percentile on weight. He's stayed on that curve his whole life. And it's been interesting to hear, some of the conversations with his pediatrician. So they're not easy conversations, and we need to have them, but we also need to have that care and that curiosity, and certainly get rid of the stigma. So that brings me to obesity care and body positivity. You had a really compelling post that I have been thinking about for some time, and you put some words to some of my strong feelings. So I'd love to talk about that post and get the conversation started within our field. I would say a productive conversation. I think the conversation's already started, but I'd like a more productive conversation about obesity care and body positivity.
Well, I start from a place that, I'll just be frank, I don't have a lot of patience with something that you call a false dichotomy, which is, there are all kinds of examples that we run into all the time. One example would be the whole nature versus nurture thing. My son happens to be studying psychology, and he when you say nature versus nurture, he says, forget about it. It's nature and nurture. The two interact. You can't tease them apart. And another of these false dichotomies is obesity care versus body positivity. And I understand where it comes from because a lot of people think that obesity care is all about weight loss. Well, that's not exactly true.
In diets.
Right. Weight loss is actually just a part, and I would even argue a small part, of obesity care.
Mm-hmm.
Weight loss, typically from studies that have been done over and over again, happens over a period of about 6 months. And then physiology kicks in and starts to resist further weight loss, and weight tends to plateau at that point. And so you can use multiple modalities. We have more tools than just diet for managing obesity. You have pharmacotherapy, and I happen to take an FDA-approved drug for obesity. You have bariatric surgery, which is life-changing for some people. And you have obesity medicine physicians who are skilled at helping people understand their medical needs related to obesity. You get to an optimal weight for an individual based upon the tools that are available. And if you think that obesity care is all about weight loss, then you make the false conclusion that you're done.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, you're not, because obesity care is really about maximizing lifelong health, which is really what folks in the health at every size movement are talking about. It's like, whatever size you're going to live at, you need to make sure you're maximizing your health. And that's the goal of just about every good obesity medicine physician that I know. I have friends who have lost substantial amounts of weight, but they're still in a range that might be labeled obesity. The answer for them at this point is not necessarily further weight loss. The answer for them is, what else can I do to maximize my health? How can I work on my physical health, my fitness, the quality of nutrition that I'm getting, any number of things to maximize my long-term health?
And mental health, emotional health.
That's exactly right. So obesity care is not the opposite of body positivity, unless you assume that obesity care is about nothing but weight loss.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a false representation. Likewise, you hear people try to mischaracterize body positivity as explaining away obesity as if it doesn't exist. Now, just like I hear people say that obesity care is all about weight loss, I also hear people say that body positivity is a righteous cause because weight doesn't matter and obesity isn't really a thing. And that's a bit of a cartoon caricature.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, body positivity is all about loving the body that you have. And that's important, regardless of where you come at this question from.
Right. When you love the body you have, you're more empowered to take care of it.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, there's no room for shame and self-hate when you're looking at feeling empowered and wanting to improve your life in some way. It's very demotivating.
That's exactly right. And that's why bias and stigma, which people in the body positivity movement have concerns about, and people in the obesity care field have concerns about. That's why bias and stigma is so noxious, so harmful to health, because it undermines that motivation to care for one's health and care for one's body.
Well, you put such helpful words to how I was feeling about obesity, overweight, and you said the word versus body positivity and health at every size. And maybe there's just a lot of misunderstanding between that false dichotomy, because as a dietitian, I keep coming back to all dietitians want people to have a good relationship with food and a good relationship with their bodies. And those things that body positivity promotes: self-care, positive, empowering thoughts, healthy mental health, healthy physical health. And yet I feel that it's completely okay to want to lose weight or to want to count carbs to control your blood sugars if you have diabetes, or to want to keep an eye out for saturated fat if you have high cholesterol. As long as you have a healthy outlook on that, that's the goal. Any one of us could be triggered or go down the wrong path by being hyper-focused on a behavior, a diet aspect, a fitness aspect that we could take too far, and things get out of balance, and that's not good for anybody.
I think that's exactly right. And I want to share with you something that I heard from a professor of human nutrition this week at the University of Sydney, Jenny Brand-Miller. And she's responsible for a lot of the research around the glycemic index. And she's also started something that you may have heard of called the Glycemic Index Foundation. She wrote to me and said, I think we were meant to eat foods we really enjoy. If we are told to eat foods that are supposed to be good for you, but we don't really enjoy them, think, for example, of low-fat everything, then I think we unconsciously go to find pleasure elsewhere. That might be a box of chocolates after dinner or the hamburger and french fries the following day. We eat them, but feel terribly guilty, and it sets us up for a yo-yo pattern and disordered eating and more problems. So the problem is not always the food system. Sometimes it's the bloody experts like me, with apologies.
Yeah, and that's, I'm the guilt-free RD because food shouldn't make you feel bad. And I just feel, again, that's so individualized. Some people can't get on a scale because those numbers just mess with their mind. Other people, it doesn't bother them. I just really think that it's so individualized. And, if somebody's eating more broccoli, but they don't like it because it's good for them, yeah, that could totally make them rebel and say, forget it. But if somebody tries adding a little bit more broccoli to their diet and, hey, you know what, I kind of like it roasted. When I was growing up, it was boiled to death and now it's roasted and I kind of like this. It's all in the experience and it's all in the personal freedom and the personal choices. And that's why I think it's so important for people to be in touch with themselves, when they're trying on these different things. Does this work? Does that work? How does it feel? I recently did a 5-day fast. Well, it was a fasting mimicking diet, and I did a podcast episode on it. And I was not looking forward to that. It wasn't even something that I was really looking to do. I just wanted to interview Dr. Felicia Stoller about the topic. Really had no interest in doing it, but I was like, well, yeah, you know what? I'll give it a try. I fully expected, with my past eating issues, I fully expected to be triggered and feeling restricted and deprived and really thrown for a loop. And I was shocked that I didn't. I am not encouraging that, everybody try something that extreme to just see how they respond. But when they're trying on this or that diet, maybe they're trying to go a little lower carb, maybe they're trying to get more fiber, maybe they're trying to, just tweak something, keeping foods that are really tempting out of the house, that sort of a thing is, you're trying that on. How does it feel inside? Are you feeling restricted? Are you feeling deprived? What kind of conversation ensues in your head? I just think it's really important for us to have self-compassion and to have that adventurous, explorative experience. And we might be surprised at what we like and what we don't like.
That's exactly right. One of the past presidents of the Obesity Society, and this is the organization, the professional organization for people who devote their careers to the study and clinical care of obesity. Dr. Alan Levine, he's an emeritus professor from the University of Minnesota and a brilliant neuroscience researcher, once told me, you just cannot lose sight of the fact that people eat for many, many reasons. Hunger is one of them. Pleasure is one of them. And there are many, many others that prompt us to eat. And if you take a narrow view of it, you are going to deceive yourself every time.
So true. Well, tell us what else people can find in your daily newsletter and your website, Conscious Health. And I know you're on Twitter. Are you on any other social media platforms?
I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm still learning about Instagram. I'm studying what you do and trying to figure out how I can be smarter about Instagram.
Join the club.
And I'm kind of a newbie on ResearchGate, but I get a lot of stuff from them.
Very cool.
It's kind of a research geeks social network. And then daily on my website, I publish short. I keep it short and sweet because who has time to read more than 300 or 400 words?
It is nice and short. You do a great job. And I know that's not easy being concise.
Yeah. And I just try to share ideas that are on my mind, with really my overall theme being one of objectivity, curiosity, and care for the people who are living with the condition of obesity. And all three of those things are things that we need more of if we're going to be successful in addressing obesity.
Yes. Well, the work you do, the posts, your tweets, everything is always very thought-provoking. You're one of the reasons I love Twitter, because I found you on Twitter. My colleagues were following you and I started seeing your work, and I'm like, this is really interesting. And I think it's pretty unique what you do, and you do it very well. I encourage everybody to follow you and check it out, because it's been really nice to learn from you and to kind of have these conversations and thought-provoking dialogue. And
oh my gosh, I've been going through the treasure trove that is all of your podcasts and some of the brilliant people from all over the world with very diverse perspectives. I mean, if you want to be curious about food and health and weight and even weight bias, just look through. I have days ahead of me of listening to your podcast and some of the really interesting people that you've talked to with really different ideas about things. And that's good. It's good to be curious about what other people are thinking.
It is good to be curious. I love that word. I feel like curiosity has been sort of my secret sauce in my podcast. Thank you for singing the praises of my guests. That's my favorite part of the show, is the people like you that I bring on that I get to learn more about, and to hear you sort of take us down the deep dive of your area of expertise. And it's just so interesting. And I love the learning and the curiosity. So thank you.
Well, one thing that, you ask what to look ahead for, I think a puzzle for us to solve. Most everybody who's working in the field of obesity feels like there's something going on with the food supply that has prompted a higher prevalence of obesity in the population. Over a period of 4 decades, we've basically tripled the number of people affected with obesity. And it's not because people have suddenly lost self-control or because the gene pool has changed. It's a number of factors. But one of the factors that everybody agrees on is there's something about the food supply. Now, some people say it's the sugar, some people say it's the fat, some people say it's the salt, some people say it's, like Michael Moss talking about the bliss point of evil big food coming in. And
I saw your post on that.
Yeah, but, I come from a background of not just health sciences, but also marketing. And I understand how people bring out marketing innovations that will satisfy consumer needs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think ultra-processed foods that people talk a lot about and that clearly seem to have some sort of effect, but we don't know why. If you look at the research that Kevin Hall published about a year ago, and he's still very active in trying to sort this out. For some reason, people do seem to eat more of the foods that we label as ultra-processed. And now the puzzle is to figure out, what is it about that? And I suspect we will find out that that label of ultra-processing is just a marker for foods that people might be inclined to consume in greater quantities, that people might find to be very enjoyable, but not necessarily very, very satisfying. And I think that's a process of evolution. That's just my supposition. And I'm objective about the fact that I don't have the answer on that. But it sure is going to be fun to figure it out and watch smart scientists figure it out.
Yes, and I think that it's an important conversation. And I always come back to wanting people to focus on nutrient-rich foods. And when I say focus on nutrient-rich foods, obviously we're going to have our foods that have empty calories, or they're fun, we like them, we enjoy them, but they're not as filling, maybe because they're not, I don't know, that ultra processed. I try to stick more with like real nutrition terms, like, okay, maybe it doesn't have a lot of fiber or protein or something that is satiating, that is very filling. I think that food is everywhere now. I mean, I remember growing up, we didn't walk around with food or beverage in our hand everywhere. And now it's like we got to have even if it's just a bottle of water, we just didn't have. So maybe we were a little less hydrated back then, but we also didn't have all these calories coming in all the time. And so, yeah, I agree. I'm sure it's not just one thing. I think it's probably a mixture of things. It's a lot easier to pack in a lot of calories when there's not a lot of fiber or protein or something that's going to fill us up. And I think that can be a slippery slope.
I think even that term of satiating is something that is worth thinking about. What is the difference between something that is satiating, that reduces your hunger, versus something that is really satisfying?
Right. Or maybe, it fills your belly, but it just didn't quite hit the spot, what you were looking for. Like for me, it's got to be milk chocolate. I don't want anything to do with that dark chocolate. And I know that's nutrition heresy, but it's the reality for me. Like I'll skip the dark chocolate and I'll wait for the milk chocolate.
Well, I think that's pretty important to figure out what brings you satisfaction, what brings you pleasure. I think pleasure is a very important function that food has.
Like I said, with the guilt-free RD, it shouldn't make you feel bad. And my tagline is sound science, smart nutrition, good food. And the good food part is really that enjoying and savoring the food. I don't think anybody can argue with that. So,
yep. But it's a journey to figure it out, isn't it?
It sure is. Oh my gosh. I think it's a lifetime journey.
Yep.
Really do.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking with us about such an important topic, obesity care, and how one size does not fit all. And for all the great work you do, we'll continue to follow you and bring you back on the show.
Thank you very much, Melissa.
My pleasure. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke.